Hi, this is a lecture on John Dewey's chapter, Experience in Philosophic Method. And this is the uh, first chapter in Experience in Nature, one of his greatest works and probably one of his most metaphysical works. So, Experience in Philosophic Method is a chapter which introduces all of experience in nature, and it introduces experience as something which is not ontologically discrete from nature. And it's going to give an account of nature where nature is much more than a blind, amoral, material mechanism. He's going to give an account of experiences consisting of both primary and secondary aspects or modes, although those are not technical terms, and experience as a starting point for philosophy and for how to do philosophy. So, insofar as experience is primary, he uses the word ordinary, he uses the word gross, crude, and macroscopic. It's essentially rock bottom. It is our lived starting point. It's where you start, it's where I start, it's where we are right now. It is a living starting point. So he wants to think about experience not in some abstruse or abstract philosophical way, but as what it's like to just be us, be alive, be in the moment. It's fundamental, he thinks, to empiricism if it's going to be done properly. And it has a methodological import for inquiries of all kinds. And this includes, of course, philosophic inquiry. Now, empiricism, Dewey thought, generally needs to be rescued. It needs to be rescued either from sensationalistic empiricism or absolutist rationalism. So he's trying to come up with a new kind of empiricism here, which avoids, as he talks about in other works, the sensationalist or sensationalistic empiricism of the British empiricists, for example, and the large rationalist system builders such as Kant, for example. He also mentions Hegel. Empiricism, Dewey thought, has to empower philosophy. It has to empower it to a different and intrinsically more connected, melioristic, moral mission. And now this is a complicated chapter, and so I just want to give a very short lecture here, and I want to hit on three different things which I think helps explain what Dewey is up to in this chapter. One, the metaphysical characterization of experience. Two, the methodological importance of experience. And three, the metaphilosophical point of doing philosophy in this way. So let's start with the first one, the metaphysical. So let's start with the first one, the metaphysical characterization of experience. What is the basic character of experience, Dewey asks. He says, well, it's ordinary, it's crude, it's everyday, it's macroscopic. He says, consider the terms life and history. These terms include both what and how of the existences it describes. It points both towards the future and towards the past. And there are many exemplary passages about the metaphysical character of experience in the chapter that I'm not going to read, but I want to read one. And it goes like this. These commonplaces, the stars, rocks, trees, in ordinary experience, prove that experience is of as well as in nature. It is not experience which is experienced, but nature. Stones, plants, animals, diseases, health, temperature, electricity. Things interacting in certain ways are experience. They are what is experienced. Linked in certain other ways with another natural object, the human organism, they are how things are experienced as well. Experience thus reaches down into nature. It has depth. It also has breadth, and to an indefinitely elastic extent. It stretches. That stretch constitutes inference. So I want you to note that experiences of existing things, and not just our subjectivity, not just our own mental movie of what's going on outside of us, right? Experience brings us deeper into nature. It is not an interface or a barrier between mind and nature. So Dewey's philosophy of experience is anti-reductionistic. What experience presents is really in nature, even if it is merely a something, that is something we haven't inquired into, we don't yet know how to describe it, or even if it is moral or aesthetic and not just physical or material. But this is something, this way of looking at things is something that science begins with. Right? And so Dewey talks about Darwin, and he says, what did Darwin begin with? He began with pigeons. He began with pigeons and their habitat and those circumstances, and he theorized about them, and he returned to pigeons. Right? So to be truly scientific in philosophy, Dewey is saying, would be a recognition of experience as method in such a way that we take seriously in philosophy what is already taken seriously in science. Now there's another portion or point that Dewey brings up, which I think is very central to his view of experience and to his thought, and that is the distinction between primary and reflective experience, or primary and secondary experience. There is, on the one hand, Dewey says, primary experience. Gross, macroscopic, crude subject matters are basic. They are what inquiry works on. That creates reflective objects later on. What are those reflective objects? Well, concepts and theories and descriptions. And the reflective objects, which are created by theory, whether it's philosophic theory or scientific theory or what have you, is then applied back onto primary experience to explain it. And this reintegration of secondary experience or reflective concepts with primary experience enriches it. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that you learn in your art history class about Impressionism. Well, if you know about Impressionism and how it came about and what makes it Impressionism, your experience, your immediate experience, your encounter with a painting will change. It will change to something else. It will be enriched. So it's not just that you know this fact about the painting. It's that when you encounter it, you have a different experience. It is altered. Or let's take another example. Let's say you take a wine tasting class and you learn that wine has this thing called a finish. It's how it tastes at the end, right? After it's sort of gone down your throat. It's the feeling on the back of the tongue and in the back of the throat. And wines have different finishes. Well, if you understand what the finish is in a wine, in the tasting of wine, your appreciation of wine will change. You'll appreciate its body, its finish, and in fact, its entirety will be different for you once you understand this element of it, which you didn't even know about before. So the point here is that your immediate experience or your primary experience can be enriched by the things you know. Okay? So secondary experience reintegrates in with your everyday primary experience. The second thing to talk about is the methodological importance of experience. How is experience a method? Well, Dewey says that experience has a primary integrity, which is, as he calls it, an unanalyzed totality. This means that there's a non-theoretical starting point in our inquiries. And we've sort of been talking about this already with primary experience. But I just want you to note that James saying that this is important as a method in philosophy, not just a kind of experience. And he's essentially accepting James's charge to be a radical empiricist. And if you're a radical empiricist, then you start with what is found in experience, the sweet, the extended, the fragile, and the moral. Magic, myth, politics, painting, and penitentiaries, Dewey says. So Dewey says there's a deep division in philosophy, and on the other hand, with science. That is, there's a deep division between philosophy and science and common sense. And philosophical method, he thinks, has to somehow overcome this dualism, right? Philosophy is seen as sort of apart from common sense and science, and it needs to be seen, they need to all be seen on a continuum. The key here, Dewey says, is that science already has an insight, and philosophy can learn from that insight. Consider this. As scientists explore their observations, right, as they experience their observations, they're already exploring the world. Right? Scientists don't need to solve the external world problem that every philosophy class talks about in Philosophy 101. This is a point that philosophy needs to take away from the sciences. They need to get this. And if they get this, they can expand and reconstruct their own conception of experience, away from the subjectivistic or absolutistic accounts in traditional philosophy, and towards something which is much more continuous with nature. And that's why the book is called Experience and Nature. It's seeing, it's an account of how to erase the dualism between experience on the one hand and nature on the other, and to create from them a continuum.